Hello there, guys. This is Christy Lewis from Dostoevsky in Space, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the 14 books that I have read about North Korea. I won't be ranking them or anything, but I'll tell you the differences, and I will tell you my favorite. So because North Korea is the theme for K-Trip-thon this year, I'm going to do this video now, even though there's so many more books out there that I want to read on the topic, and I'm going to be continuing reading books on the topic. It seems like now's the time to make the video. I also wanted to throw out a couple honorable mention resources. They aren't books. However, you can learn a lot about North Korea through these resources. So one, if you prefer the 2-hour version rather than the multiple hour versions that you'll find in books, you can check out the documentary Beyond Utopia, which is available on Hulu. And I recently watched this with Tiffany because this was a group watch for K-Trip-thon 2025, and it was well worth watching. Seeing the faces of people going through it. One family is filmed throughout the whole process of getting from the Chinese border all the way to South Korea now. It follows that process. It doesn't follow them straight over the border from North Korea, but it kind of shows the plight of North Koreans who are often trafficked over the border, and then if they are women, they are sex trafficked into China. If they are not useful enough to the brokers, who are basically in it for the money, it's more worth it for the brokers to betray the people that are crossing the border because they get more money from the North Korean government that way. So it's following a couple families' harrowing journeys. And one family in particular is filmed the whole way through. So yeah, really an excellent documentary. I also wanted to talk about the Dimple Video channel on YouTube, which does like North Koreans reacting to different elements of South Korean or American culture. And it allows them to talk about their experiences from North Korea. It just sort of gives them visibility. And Dimple, because there's a lot of kind of cute things like, oh, North Korea tries ramyeon for the first time in South Korea, or talking about North Korean TikToks and things like that, really interesting, fun stuff. There was a North Korean and a South Korean talking about some of the differences between North Korea, meeting Americans for the first time, because a lot of North Koreans are brainwashed to believe that Americans are evil. So, very interesting channel. Would recommend Dimple Video. And also One Verse, or Universe is actually how it's pronounced, but it's spelled One Verse, is a new K-pop group that is the first K-pop group to have North Korean members. 2 of them are North Korean members. And they have a lot of English language content as well because they have some American members. So definitely check out Universe. They're a brand new group. They just debuted. Okay, on to the books. Of course, I have to talk about Escape from Camp 14 by Blaine Harden. This is our group book this year for K-Trope-a-thon. Here it is. This is a book that came out in 2012, and I actually listened to it way back then. And there has been an update. So check out the Kindle edition for the update, because that has been updated. But if you get a physical copy or if you listen to the audiobook, a lot of those don't have the update from 2015. So absolutely listen to it on audio or read it physically. And if you can get your hands on a Kindle copy, you can check out the new foreword from the author from 2015. So basically this is a tell-all from a man who escaped from one of North Korea's labor camps. They're punishment camps for people whose families have offended North Korea in some way by not being loyal enough. And so we'll talk more about loyalty later. But he is the first, Shin Dong-hyuk, who is the person interviewed by Blaine Harden in this book, is the first known person to have escaped from the prison camps and survived to tell the tale. There are other survivors of the camps who were released from the camps. Sometimes you go there for a decade and then you're released, or, it was a family member who committed the offense, and so eventually the grandchildren are released or something. Things like that happen. But he's the only person we know of who actually escaped and lived to tell the tale. So, and there are some scenes of torture. It's very disturbing, but I feel like Blaine Harden does such a fabulous job of drawing out details, and he talked to many defectors, not just Shin Dong-hyuk, to write this. He compared the stories between them, and there's a lot that's actually pretty verifiable in today's day and age, even though some of the details of his story changed. That's really normal for trauma survivors, and it's a really compelling introduction to a lot of the issues that you'll find. Things have changed a little bit since 2012, since this was published. But if you want to hear some of the updates, I just did an interview on my channel with Blaine Harden, the author who interviewed Shin Dong-hyuk. And I will link that down below in the description so you can check that out if you're interested in learning more about how COVID has changed things. There's actually a lot fewer defectors coming over the border. So these memoirs have become even more precious since COVID because it's a lot harder now for people to escape. So yeah, I would highly, highly recommend. This is one of the best books I've read on the topic. But every book that I'm going to mention today has its own perspective and a unique story to tell, and I learned something new with each one of them. So currently, this is actually one that I haven't finished yet, but I'm reading it currently for K-Drop Land, and I wanted to talk about it because it is really unique. And like I said, they each do have their own story to tell. So another book that I'm going to tell you about is about Kim Il-sung, who is the great leader. So I'll talk about that one. This one is about Kim Jong-il, who is the son of Kim Il-sung. So Kim Jong-il production by Paul Fischer. This is the story of two South Korean filmmakers, like the first ones who filmed in Technicolor, and it's actually a film producer and his actress wife, both who have major star power in South Korea at the time. And they were kidnapped by Kim Jong-il in order to produce a movie in North Korea. North Korea was actually known for its movies during this time. When was this? I forget the exact dates, but during Kim Jong-il's reign. So he's the son of the great leader who started North Korea, who kind of established North Korea as a nation. So he was a movie buff. He was obsessed with movies and watched everything that came out for a decade before kind of becoming in charge of this cultural, of the Department of Culture in North Korea, which basically put out films. That was what they were really good at because it was state controlled. The state could really easily control a group project like a film versus like a novel, which is harder to control because it's one person who's writing the majority of it. Of course, there's editors and there's publishers and things like that. There's some elements of control over things like a novel, but it's really easy to control films. And so you learn a lot about Kim Jong-il in this one, and it kind of helped me separate the two in my mind. The great leader from the dear leader is what Kim Jong-il is called. So yeah, this has been really, really compelling so far, following the two filmmakers' lives and then Kim Jong-il's lives. And I'm only about 20% in. So, but this was also recommended by the author and his wife, her husband, of Banned Book Club, which I won't be talking about in today's video because that one's about South Korea. But yeah, so some of this is set in South Korea, but it's really about the kidnapping and the production of this film. Okay, moving on. Black Girl from Pyongyang. This is by Monica Macias. Now her father was a dictator of, is it New Guinea? They're Equatorial Guinea, excuse me. And she lived in North Korea for her young life. I think she was very young, like age 5 or age 7 or something like that, when she was moved from Equatorial New Guinea into North Korea. And it was like a dictator to dictator thing where the leader of Equatorial New Guinea was like, here, educate my kids and take care of them, and then they can come back home and build up my nation. And so that was the idea of sending her there. She at first was like, I feel like this memoir is like her processing her experience. And so I actually ended up DNFing it like around 60 or 70% because I was reading it physically. And she has like this mental block about people criticizing North Korea or her father. I understand criticizing her father, but she grew very attached to North Korea and sort of believed the lies put out by the propaganda department because that is where she lived and that was her experience. She was one of the elite. She was treated extremely well. There was a lot of control and things that she didn't like about it, but she feels very protective of North Korea. And so I feel like she was really shocked. She was really shocked when she left North Korea finally, and to find that the whole world hated North Korea and was like very negative about it. So if you want to hear it from an insider who experienced the propaganda firsthand and like believes it, check out Monica Macias's Black Girl from Pyongyang. It is a really unique telling and it's very modern in a sense. I mean, it was published quite a while ago now in South Korea, but it was more recently published in the US, like in 2024 or 2023 or something. So yeah, In Search of My Identity, and that's really what it is. It's about her search to kind of figure out who she is. She didn't even like remember how to speak Spanish or anything. Like Korean was her identity, but she was Black. And when she left North Korea and started living elsewhere, it was really hard for her to figure out, okay, do I belong to this new country? Do I belong to North Korea? Do I belong to Equatorial New Guinea, even though I don't speak Spanish anymore and I don't know my family? And so yeah, it's like her identity crisis. I'm not sure I would like recommend it. But it was really interesting to hear from somebody who actually does believe the propaganda, as most people in North Korea do. Most people do believe the propaganda in North Korea, and she absolutely does. A lot of people who escape from North Korea, like a lot of the North Korean defector memoirs, they wholeheartedly reject everything that they were taught about North Korea. Eventually they come to that conclusion when they're like writing the books, and they're writing their memoirs. They have usually by that time rejected it. She has not rejected it. So that was a really interesting viewpoint for me to read. It was very unique in that sense. A lot of North Korean defectors do struggle, just like she did, to believe, for example, that America did not start the Korean War. Like North Korea has told its citizens that Americans started the war, when in reality it was North Korea that started the war. So yeah, fascinating. I'm not sure I would recommend it, but it was really unique. So if you're looking for a different take from somebody who actually experienced the brainwashing and hasn't rejected it. Okay, next, let's talk about The Reluctant Communist. This is a book about an American soldier who was stationed in South Korea and deserted by crossing into the DMZ into North Korea. And he was captured and held there for like 40 years or something. I can't remember exactly how long. And this was brought to my attention because just a couple years ago, there was another American soldier who also defected to North Korea. He crossed the line into North Korea. So the 39th parallel, I think that's what's called, 38th parallel. Army Private Travis T. King was in the news, and that's why I ended up picking this up. This was really unique because the narrator, he reminded me a lot of Forrest Gump. He was a country boy, a country American, not too bright, got very drunk the night that he crossed over, caused all kinds of trouble, also starred in movies, which is interesting, in North Korea. He was cast as the evil American in a lot of North Korean films. I think this was really unique. I ended up not really being super impressed by this guy, which it's probably not a surprise. I just realized it was too small for you guys. Not really a surprise, but the thing is, you end up learning about these kidnappings of Japanese citizens who were held in the same way that he was. Basically, they experienced better treatment by North Korea because they were wanting to be used for certain purposes, whereas most North Koreans aren't useful to the government, so they aren't treated well. They at least had better treatment because of their status. They weren't born North Koreans. So there were several Japanese citizens who were kidnapped and brought to North Korea, and one of those Japanese citizens ended up basically being given to him, and he was told basically, you should rape her. And he was like, no, I'm not going to rape her. However, they did end up falling in love after being sort of enclosed together for quite a long time. He fell in love with her and proposed, and they ended up getting married and having kids. And eventually, Japan got them released because they learned that some of their missing persons were actually people who'd been kidnapped and brought to North Korea. So this was really interesting. I just listened to it on audio, and well worth for the Japanese angle, well worth it. And to hear about an American who made this like super questionable choice, he has like a really unique perspective on things. Okay, so moving on, we have In Order to Live by Yeonmi Park. Now, don't be fooled. There's a lot of sort of U.S., I would say, information out there about her because she also speaks in the U.S. Frequently about politics and how they remind her of politics in North Korea. This is not about that. This is long before she became a famous figure and started talking about politics in the U.S. This is Yeonmi Park's story of how and why she escaped North Korea into China and eventually made it to South Korea and eventually became a U.S. citizen studying at Columbia University. So she is somebody who was extremely poor in the 90s. And in fact, she and her sister lived without adult supervision for extended periods and almost starved. They basically survived on bugs and weeds, which was not an uncommon story during the 90s when everybody was starving in North Korea. She is very common. Most of the refugees at this time were single young women of a poor background. A lot of times, I can't remember. There was a certain region of North Korea in particular where defectors were extremely common from that area. And she was among those. And so she was not treated as like, I feel like a lot of North Korean defectors eventually get treated almost royally for sharing their perspective and for making it and for being heroes. And she was not treated that way anytime because she was so poor. And she was, as soon as she escaped over the border into China, which is an extremely common way that North Korean defectors used to escape before COVID, she was immediately sex trafficked at the age of like 14. And eventually she secures passage to South Korea. And living in South Korea was extremely hard for her because, again, she had been brainwashed like so many. And she talks a lot more about the brainwashing than a lot of the other defectors. She talks extensively about how that made her feel and how that affected her thinking. But basically, she teaches herself a lot through reading. She just reads voraciously once she gets to South Korea and comes to Columbia, and she shares her journey of adapting to America. And eventually, she ends up sharing what happened to her in China. For most of the early years, she didn't share that she'd been sex trafficked. So her story is really, it's not unique, but it's unique among memoirs. I haven't quite read another memoir where they go into such detail about that experience of traveling through China and being sex trafficked. So she and her mother as well, they were together. So yeah, this was, it helped me think it helped me sort of, it was for the first time I was hearing some of the history of how North Korea came to be, like how it was propped up by the communist nations around it, and then it collapsed as soon as those communist nations stopped supporting it, and the results, which were the famines of the 90s. So yeah, this one was really powerful. If you're just going to read one memoir and you want one that's like really digestible, I would definitely recommend In Order to Live by Yeonmi Park. There's a reason why this one has the most name recognition. It's very compelling, extremely compelling. Okay, moving on, we have Every Falling Star, which is the subtitle is The True Story of How I Survived and Escaped from North Korea by Sungju Lee and Susan McClelland. Actually, this is a new book cover. I've never seen this one before. So this is the story. What's really unique about this one is the entire story is about a kotjebi, which is a street kid, basically, who lives on the street, lives by stealing, lives in a gang, and it kind of tells the story of how he feels guilty about this later on, about stealing food from people, but as an orphan, that was the only way he was going to survive. And it was a really unique story from that perspective. There aren't a lot of stories about kotjebi who escape North Korea. So this is actually a young adult novel. Most of the books that I'm telling you about are like adult. They're aimed towards adults, but this one is aimed towards teenagers because that is the experience. And yeah, it's about his experience living. His father was like a general and then lost favor. And then he ends up losing contact with his mom and his dad and living on the street, which is not an uncommon experience at all in North Korea, and how he survives. And it's really heartrending and interesting. And you're just so glad that he ends up escaping it in the end. Whew, yeah. So if you want to hear a young person's perspective, this is unique in that sense. I haven't found any other books that are from that perspective of youth. Okay, next we have Nothing to Envy by Barbara Demick. Now this is interesting because it follows multiple North Koreans across different socioeconomic levels, especially through the famine of the 90s again in North Korea, but also they're different ages, so they do have different experiences. Like one of the middle-aged women that's featured in here, she experiences more than just the famine of the 90s. She remembers more than that because she wasn't just a young person at the time of her living in North Korea, and she didn't just experience the 90s. She experienced North Korea before the 90s, and it's also different, varying levels of like willingness to leave. Like the middle-aged woman was completely brainwashed. She did not want to leave. Her daughter tricked her over the border into China and then eventually sort of deprogrammed her from the North Korean propaganda in China. And there's like a young couple who were in love and in North Korea, and it follows both of them. And then it also follows them after they have escaped and they're actually living in South Korea and how they meet up again. So they knew each other. And I just think Barbara Demick does such a fabulous job. She also talks a lot you also will learn a lot just about North Korea as a whole through this book. Barbara Demick is such a fabulous journalist. This is my second book that I've read by her, and there's a reason why it was a National Book Award finalist. It's extremely well done. Nothing to Envy is from a North Korean propaganda song that everybody knows, and North Koreans sing because North Koreans believe that they are living in paradise and that they're lucky to live there and the rest of the world is awful, which is how they try and how they successfully control the people of North Korea and prevent them from overthrowing the government and changing their country for the better or just leaving and fleeing. That's how they try to control the flood, basically. And it talks a lot about that. So, sorry, I thought I turned off my alarms. No, I did not. Okay, Moving on. Let's talk about the girl with 7 names. This is another young woman defecting from North Korea. However, in this case, she was just being a rebellious teenager and visiting family in China for a month, and then didn't cross back over, and then never was allowed to cross back over again because the government found out about her absence, and then it would have endangered her family to go back. So she and her family were wealthy enough that they did not feel the famine of the 90s in the same way that people like Yeonmi Park and her family did. They were not starving. They saw people starve. They saw dead people in the streets. And that's something Yeonmi Park describes as something that she saw frequently, was people starving in the streets and her doing nothing to help them because it was such a common sight. And she was so young that it just was like over her head. She's like, yeah, of course that's happening. That happens every day, you know. Hyeonseo Lee, while she kind of knew of the human suffering going on around her, didn't experience it as much for herself. However, she ended up having a really harrowing story of having to sort of keep her identity a secret in China as she's living with family. And she talks about the difficulty of that. It really explores partly, as I've read all of these books about North Korea, I've sort of realized why China sends North Korean defectors back to North Korea to be imprisoned and killed, executed. And I've sort of realized why they do that. But Hyeonseo Lee, it's because they find it useful for North Korea to be a buffer against America, basically, on one of their borders. China does not want a pro-America country like South Korea on their border. They would prefer to be anti-America, like North Korea. So that it serves them to keep North Korea in power and hating America. So I don't think that's the whole reason. That's a very like American-centric view, I understand. But China really doesn't want American interests surrounding them. On all of their borders, they would like to have communist-friendly countries. So anyways, Hyeonseo Lee and Yeonmi Park explain the experience of being in China as a North Korean as a result of that. There are a lot of Chinese who are more friendly or at least happy to take advantage of North Koreans because of the cheap labor that they provide. And China is very cosmopolitan. And in the past, China actually was a place where Koreans would live on the border and send, Korean dramas and stuff over the border, like trafficked material to try and change the minds of North Koreans and reveal the lies of their country and their government to them. But yeah, really unique. And I think what I really found super unique about the girl with 7 names was her experience of freedom in South Korea was really different from Yeonmi Park's, whereas they both really struggled. Yeonmi Park really takes the responsibility on herself to better herself enough to survive it and thrive. And she learns English and she does just all this amazing. Hyeonseo Lee also learns English. She actually gives like a great TED talk and she's interviewed quite a lot in that documentary Beyond Utopia. However, she has a lot of criticisms about how South Korea is handling North Korean defectors. And I actually have some quotes here about that. In South Korea, too, social status matters a lot, but here it is not hereditary. So in North Korea, sungbun is basically your loyalty ranking in North Korea. Loyalty is really money matters a lot in North Korea, but to the government, if you are not 1000% loyal for 3 generations, you get punished for that. You get lowered. That's what happened to the Koche B-boy. His father was not loyal enough. In South Korea, too, social status matters a lot, but here it is not hereditary. It is determined through education. And although education is a great leveler in South Korea, even the children of the wealthy will get nowhere if they do poorly at school. It brings with it oppressions of its own. It is partly the reason why South Koreans are, according to surveys, the unhappiest people in the developed world. So she has her own criticisms about South Korea. She, for example, falls in love with a South Korean man and he loves her, but he can't marry her because of her background, because she's not like professional enough, basically. And so they don't end up getting married because he's like, you should really, go back to school and become like, I don't know, a doctor or something, like something really professional that would impress my family. If you're not high enough status for my family. And so actually in Nothing to Envy by Barbara Demick, there's a surgeon who experiences something really similar. She serves as in a hospital in North Korea, and that's like her life's calling. But then when she defects to the South, all of her training, all of her knowledge, her schooling, none of it counts for anything in South Korea because North Korea is so closed to the rest of the world. And so she basically has to start over from the beginning. And so, yeah. Okay. Anyways, moving on to the next thing. Let's talk about The Aquariums of Pyongyang, which is a really early book. This was published in 2020, or in 2000, excuse me. So 25 years ago now. This was the first account of the North Korean labor camps. He is somebody who, he and his family were sent to a labor camp as a result of a family member, and he was a child when he was sent there, and they were there for 10 years. And he talks about the labor camps extensively. This was really grim, but I feel like this would actually be a great place to start because he gives a pretty detailed history about the the Korean War in particular. Every book that I'm talking about covers slightly different periods of history, I feel like. This one covers the Korean War quite extensively. So, and he also calls North Korea the world's last Stalinist regime, which is true. So I feel like I got a lot more context reading this one. So I feel like this one, like I said, would be a good place to start for that reason. There's a lot of introductory material that if you're not aware of, it can give you context to the rest of it. And yeah, I would recommend this one as well. It is one of the older ones, but because the thing about North Korea is it doesn't actually change a lot. Not much has changed. Like the ability of defectors to cross over the border has changed. The ability to send pirated materials over the border has tightened and changed. And so there isn't as much of like a free market system happening there now, which that was the only thing that helped them pull out of the 90s was the free market system that developed. But the gulags, nothing has changed there. So to learn about the gulags, this would be like the perfect way to do that because it's still the same as it was 25 years ago, or even before that was when he was actually there. This book was published 25 years ago. And so you can maybe 35 years ago is how it's describing the gulags, but the gulags have been there since like the 50s. So not much has changed, unfortunately. It's one of the longest running human rights abuses in history. And we don't even talk about it with North Korea because they just leave the table if you do. All we can talk about with North Korea is the nukes, the nuclear program. But we really should be talking to them about this. And we should make that a priority because they are brainwashing and punishing their citizens without guilt by association, no trials. People are worked to death in these horrible conditions and then expected to like adjust to normal society again on the outside. So yeah, it's horrible. Okay, next we have Brother's Keeper by Julie Lee. Now this is actually a historical fiction for kids, but man, is it grim. I read this as an adult and it was grim for me. So what this covers is North Koreans who lived through the war, the Korean War, and what it was like to just be a normal North Korean citizen during the war. And so it's about a sister and her young brother who are separated from their family at one point during a bombing. And they have to make their way to the south and cross the border on their own. And it's an amazing story. And it also talks a lot about the experience of a Korean woman being in disfavor compared to her brother. Like, she has to take really good care of her brother because the whole family is very focused on him. Like, her education, she's not allowed to be educated anymore because she has to work to pay for her brother's education, that kind of a thing. And that's just a very real experience in a lot of Asian countries that are Confucian. Women are viewed as lesser than men. And so, yeah, if you want to actually put yourself in the mind of a North Korean, this would be a perfect historical novel to do that during the Korean War. And yeah, I would recommend it for that reason. It is good for kids, but it is grim. And I would say if you're having your child read it with them and talk about it with them. Because on its own, it's, like I said, very grim. Okay, and we're going to talk about another book for kids. This is a Nathan Hale's Hazardous Tale. It's called Cold War Correspondent. So this is a graphic novel about the Korean War as well. And this is the first time I learned about the incredible defeat at the beginning of the North Korean War, where North Korea surprises the South by crossing the border, and they conquer almost the entirety of South Korea. There's only like a little portion of it left. And sort of the hubris of the General MacArthur, I think, is who's in charge of the Americans who come to aid the South, and like the ineffectiveness of their weaponry. And then eventually how the Americans push back to the line of demarcation, but then they can't actually conquer the North. And in another book that I'm going to be talking about, that's viewed from a very adult perspective. This is like almost like a quick sketch of it. But this was great for kids. I would definitely recommend this. It was extremely compelling, and there's like some humor injected into it. And yeah, I would definitely recommend this. This was really, really well done. For that age group, I feel like there's not a ton out there about North Korea for that age group. But yeah, okay, moving on. Let's talk about, I forgot to grab this one. But it's A History of Korea by Kyung Hwang. I actually own it. So it would be right here if I was holding it up. So this is a history of Korea. And it is about North Korea because Korea was one nation until in World War II, when the Japanese invaded Korea, and then the Japanese lost. Then the Russians took over above the 38th parallel, and the U.S. soldiers took over below the 38th parallel, and they kind of facilitated handing over control from the Japanese back to the Koreans. And both countries had different goals with North and South Korea. Suddenly, arbitrarily, there was two nations, and there wasn't two nations there before. It was all one nation throughout Korean history. And so, I just lost my place here. But anyways, A History of Korea makes that really clear, and it talks about sort of the different development. At a certain point, the book splits off, and you'll be reading about North Korea in one section and then South Korea in the other section. And so if you want like an overall picture of all the history of that, I would definitely say A History of Korea is a great resource. It's available on audiobook and a physical book. I'm not sure if there's an ebook available. It's not available through the library. It probably is available online, but and it's fairly short. It's 250 pages. Like, it's really not too long as far as histories go. And so, yeah, I would recommend it if you want a better view of how Korea was one nation in its history and then how it was separated. And then finally, the last book that I wanted to talk about that I have read is The Great Leader in the Fighter Pilot by Blaine Harden. Now, we also talk quite a lot about this book in that video, that interview that I have on my channel. So if you want to learn more about it, check that out. But basically, this is a dual biography of the great leader, Kim Il-sung, who established North Korea, and sort of the historical situation that led to him becoming the leader. Like, he was a fighter in the war against Japanese, because the Japanese were they had invaded Korea during World War II. So he fought the Japanese in World War II. The Japanese were considered like the great enemy, whereas China was a friend, and Russia was a friend, because of course, Russia was the occupying army in the north, like I talked about with the Hazardous Tale book. And yeah, a true story about the birth of tyranny in North Korea. So it does trace the rise of Kim Il-sung, and at the same time, it's following a normal guy who lived through all of these transitional periods, which was super interesting. Like, he lived in Korea during the Japanese occupation, and then he lived in North Korea once it was once it was taken over by Russia. He lived as it developed into a communist nation, and he thrived. He rose through the ranks by like pretending he was a communist and like mouthing his loyalty to the party. And then he took his fighter pilot, which he worked his way up to flying and learned how to fly during the Korean War, and he flew it over the border right to South Korea. And he ends up sharing all of the information that he knows about North Korea to the Americans, and ends up becoming an American. So it's really an interesting and very unique story of somebody who actually lived through the creation of North Korea, and who did not believe the lies. He's one of the rare North Korean citizens who did not believe the lies. And partly that's because of his father, but he was also just really bright, and he could see that everything was a lie that he was being told. So, but that's not the norm in North Korea. Most North Koreans actually do believe the lies. So yeah, this was really, really good. I feel like I understand the history a lot better now after reading this, particularly of the wars that were at the inception of North Korea. And how North Korea was exactly created. This is really good for that. Yeah, so that would be the last book. There's, like I said, so many more books that I want to read on the topic of North Korea. And I'm planning to keep going and keep reading. So stay tuned if you want to learn about more. I always, in my wrap-ups, will include the titles and author names and timestamps. So you can always check out my wrap-ups and read the titles, and then skip to the title of your choice if you're interested in learning more about North Korea. I'll be continuing my research on this topic because I find it endlessly fascinating. So that is it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure that you let me know in the comments your favorite books about North Korea. Recommend some. Where should I head next? And I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.